the Gongfu Crew podcast, bringing together practitioners of various styles and schools and their unique perspectives to explore the world of Chinese martial arts. This episode of the Gongfu Crew podcast will focus on Xingyiquan, one of the so-called internal styles of Chinese martial arts, whatever that exactly means, but also one of the most well-known forms of Kung Fu or Wushu. Specifically, Xingyiquan was one of the styles that was brought to Beijing, the capital of the Republic of China in the early 20th century, that became quite renowned there. Many of their practitioners, their masters and teachers, were highly skilled fighters and soon made a reputation for themselves, but also for the training method of Xingyi. The expert practitioner who is going to introduce the methods of Xingyiquan is none other than Byron Jacobs, currently residing in Beijing and probably known to many of you through his Drunken Boxing podcast, also focused on martial arts, as well as his Mushin martial arts culture YouTube channel and Instagram channel, where he is also sharing a lot of videos regarding Xingyiquan and Baguazhang, but also the history of these styles and martial arts in China in general. He had the opportunity to learn Xingyiquan from Di Guoyong, one of the most renowned experts and masters of Xingyiquan as well as Baguazhang, currently living in Beijing. And he was also willing to share his profound insights with me for this podcast episode. And I hope that you find it as insightful and fascinating as I did. Welcome, Byron, to the Gongfu Crew podcast. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to talk to you. Before we dive into martial arts, maybe you can give a quick introduction, maybe let people know who you are. I would assume that a lot of people already know you, but for those who don't, maybe you can give them a short rundown of who you are and what you've been doing so far.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. I'm glad. I'm quite interested to see other people do the same. More podcasts on Chinese martial arts, because I think we need to promote the Chinese martial arts as much as possible. So I'm glad that there's yet another one for people to listen to. My name is Byron Jacobs. I was originally born in South Africa. I'm a Greek Cypriot descent. I started doing martial arts very young, mostly with Japanese styles. And then in my teens, I started doing various Chinese martial arts that were available to me in the area. Following that, I started doing a lot more of the sport-oriented Chinese martial arts, including forms and combat disciplines. I always felt that you needed to do both, which in hindsight, I realized was weird in the sports environment of the way the sport is set up, but that we can get into later. And throughout that, I'd always been interested primarily in traditional Chinese martial arts. And for some reason, Xingyiquan had always been something that I'd been interested in. Long story short, I eventually started doing Xingyiquan with Di Guoyong in Beijing. And I would come out annually. I'd been coming out to Beijing since early 2000s, 2001, 2002, annually, to train as well, but then I was coming out after I'd met Di Guoyong to train with him annually. And then at about the end of 2009, I thought, well, I need to be with him all the time to do this properly. So I moved to Beijing permanently at the end of 2009, beginning of 2010. And I've been training with him, doing both his Hebei Xingyiquan and his Liang style Bagua, primarily focused on Xingyi. I try to follow his road or his route that he went, which was he had become become basically what you'd consider a master of Xingyiquan before he started doing Bagua, and I thought that I'd like to follow that same route. Oh, sorry about that.
Makes sense, yeah.
And so that was that. Professionally, in the interim, because of my experience in Chinese martial arts, and I had done quite a bit in the official realm in South Africa, I'd also been a national, what we call a pro-tier athlete, which is the highest level athlete recognition you can get in South Africa for the sports thing. When I started living in China, I'd already been quite an experienced Chinese martial arts judge for the International Wushu Federation, and then I became a member of their technical committee. Then I became their technical and event manager for the International Federation, and I was also the person that did the technical representation for the Olympic bid. Again, we can get into that, but that was always a how can I say it? That was my work, and I had been always trying to somewhat shift the direction of the sport to try to come back to some semblance of sanity, through my involvement in the technical side of things there. But I parted ways with the international organization in 2018. But that was, like I said, it was something on the side in terms of Chinese martial arts practice. My practice has always been what I've been doing, Xingyiquan, etc., traditional styles. So that's me in a nutshell. I started the Mushin Martial Culture YouTube channel a few years ago, trying to put out more content. I put out both instructional material as well as translated and other culturally connected to Chinese martial arts, including older materials, newer materials, interviews, etc. And more recently, I published a book, which I've been working on for about 10 years, called Dragon Body, Tiger Spirit, a translation of the classic text of Xingyiquan.
Yeah, that's why I assume that I guess a lot of people already know you because you've been quite active online. We should definitely get into like how you started to learn from your teacher at some point, but maybe let's do some housekeeping first in the sense of maybe define some of these terms, because we talk a lot about martial arts and Gongfu and Wushu and stuff like that. So how would you define martial arts? Like, what is martial arts to you?
All right. So, I mean, in general, martial arts would be a practice or a physical activity that includes aspects primarily focused on combat in various forms, whether it's barehanded or weapons or both. I don't want to get too much in terms of when I consider the term martial arts, I don't want to try to give it a date, because I think if you try to give it a date, you're going to run into trouble. So when we talk about general martial arts, we're talking about an activity that a person engages in to train combat arts, whether armed or unarmed. That would be the general definition. Chinese martial arts, however, is something specific as well. So that would be a subdivision of martial arts.
And what term would you use then? Do you use usually the term wushu or gongfu, or I mean there are older terms for this as well, but like what do you usually do?
So both of those terms, I think, are valid terms. And at different stages throughout my life, I would have favored one or the other. But, we have a history that we have to be aware of. Definition of the correct term or not aside, you have to be kind of aware that certain terms were used in a specific way in different parts of the world, and you can't ignore that. So wushu should be the correct general term for Chinese martial arts. And unfortunately, in today's times and due to the history, that has been more connected with the sportified version of it, which is highly acrobatic and very performance-based, which is kind of ironic, but that's a different discussion. And Kung Fu is the term that most people understand in the West as Chinese martial arts. I mean, I had times when I said wushu to people that didn't know much, that asked me if that was a pork dish. So I can understand that we have to be aware of these, and that's why I say we could probably use either or. If you want me to say which is the correct term, of course I'm going to say wushu is the correct term, but then we'd have to sit and do a whole lot of redefining the other, for example, the sport version of it, and that should, in my opinion, have a different name. Yeah. So I would use them both interchangeably. Kung Fu, I think, is a little bit clearer when we're talking about to Westerners and you want to say, I'm doing traditional Chinese martial arts. It's just so much easier to say, I do Kung Fu. And then they understand for the most part. So, yeah.
And what I found interesting is that my experience in China, a lot of people, like people who actually practice, I don't know. They would use probably Gongfu in the original sense of skill, like developing skill. They understand that it's also used to describe martial arts in general. But in my experience, they wouldn't even use wushu either. They would just call it chuan or chuanfa or something like
lian chuan.
Yeah, exactly. So it's quite interesting that I think they're very pragmatic about this, right? It's
well, even you'll have a time. I mean, you've been here, so at times, if you tell people that you do wushu here, they might ask you, 中国 wushu ma? Because they understand the term wushu as the term martial arts in English.
Yeah.
Which is why I say in Chinese, it is the correct term. In English, wushu should be the correct term referring to Chinese martial arts. But you can see in Chinese, wushu literally means martial arts.
Yeah, so, it's all of it, yeah. Yeah, I had the same experience when you talk to young Chinese people. For them, Gongfu, they also ask me exactly this, like, oh, Zhongguo Gongfu, like Chinese Gongfu, rather than, I think that's what I mean. I think they were very pragmatic because, I mean, these are just terms in the language.
Yeah, and we know Gongfu means, a skill developed over time. I mean, that's the actual meaning, and it could be for anything. You could have Gongfu for cooking or playing the piano or,
But I think because of that confusion, I think it's always good to make sure that maybe not even necessarily use the same terms, but that we know what we mean when we actually say wushu or kungfu or whatever.
Right.
I think that's helpful. So let's get into it. I mean, you already said that you had quite a bit of martial arts background before actually learning from Yong, but then you always had an interest in Xingyiquan. But how did you get to learn from Yong? Like, what was the impact or the initial impulse? You said, oh yeah, this is the guy I want to learn from, and this is what I want to do.
So like I mentioned, I'd always had an interest in the art, and I'd always been trying to get my hands on whatever I could get my hands on. And one of the things I got was a DVD that my teacher had produced. It was a series that were produced by some company in I think it's in Guangzhou. Maybe 20 years ago now, or I don't even know if it's even longer than that. I mean, I don't actually recall when they were produced. And I watched the DVD and I was like, he's very clear, very, direct. It's clear and precise instruction. I want to learn from this guy. And I'd done more searching and I found that his books had been translated into English by Andrea Falk in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I reached out to Andrea and I bought his books, and I also sent her an email asking if there's any way to get in contact with him. And she gave me his contact details. I mean, very nice of her. So she is actually the catalyst that really led me to him. And of course, I'm eternally grateful to her. She's my elder martial sister. So that's basically how I got in contact with him. And then when I came through to Beijing, then I contacted him, and I still remember the first day. He said, "Oh yeah, well, I'm at Zhiyuan on tomorrow. You can come tomorrow at this time." Zhiyuan is Purple Bamboo Park, which is not far from where he lives. It's close to Haidian, which he lives in Haidian district. And I mean, it's a big park, and he said close to this gate at this time. And it was quite funny because I had gone there on time, but I think he might have forgotten that I said I was coming. He was there anyway. And I walked past him, not at the spot that I said I'd meet him at. There was some guy doing calligraphy on with water on the floor. And he was standing next to him, watching him do calligraphy. And I saw him and I was like, Di Lao Shi. And he's like, oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, what time is it? Oh, yes. And, but, that could have gone a million other ways. I could have missed him, not seen him, walked to the other side. He might have mistaken the time. I would have been waiting. I probably would have stayed for a long time. But who knows what fate would have been like if I didn't walk past him. So, yeah, that was the first time.
And I guess something must have made you stay, right? So when you started learning from him, what was it that convinced you that, oh yeah, this is going to be maybe he didn't know right in the beginning, but obviously he has become your main teacher. So what was it?
So like I said, I could see from his both his books and his DVDs, he was a very logical, clear, down-to-earth teacher. And as you know, I had a background dealing with the international organizations before that. So I had met a bunch of, well-known teachers in the past. And there was just something about not only his logic and his attitude, but his spirit that was very open, but very honest and direct. I guess that's just a result of Xingyiquan, but the honesty part was also something, different, but also very grounded. He was down to earth. He still is. He's a very down to earth guy. There's no space for mumbo jumbo and nonsense with him. He'll tell you exactly what he thinks and why he thinks so. And usually he's 100% right when he explains to you why he thinks something is either useless or incorrect. He doesn't just say that because, you've probably had this experience with some Chinese teachers that they'll tell you it's wrong, but if you ask them why it's wrong, either they'll get upset with the question or they won't be able to explain. Well, he's the exact opposite. He'll tell you this is not the best way to do it, and then he'll sit and stare at you because he's waiting for you to ask him why. And if you don't ask him why, he's like, this kid's not very interested, he's a bit lazy, he's not going to be a good student. So he wants you to ask why, and then he'll show you and explain without a doubt why it is the way it is, or why something means what it means, or why you should do something in a specific way. So I knew that this person was exactly who I needed to be studying from.
So how did you then learn Xingyiquan? I mean, I would assume that because you already had some background, you maybe didn't start from scratch, or I don't know. But what does it look like when you would learn Xingyi from Di Guoyong?
So that I'll give you a bit of an overview of that first day. Of course, I had his books and I had his basic DVD, and I had been trying to follow a little bit on my own. So of course he asked me my background. I told him I had a predominantly northern background. I did some classical, traditional northern as well as contemporary northern. So I had done quite a lot of northern Chinese martial arts and some other stuff too. I did some southern too, but northern was my focus. And then I told him I'd also, been practicing from the DVD and from his books. I've been doing Xingyiquan basics. And he's like, okay. And by that point, I had thought, I know the 5 elements, right? That's what I thought. He said, okay, let me see your santisha, which is the post standing. It's one of the core training methods of Xingyiquan. It's the forever exercise. You start with it and you die doing it at the end of your life as well. So I did santisha thinking, this is going to be good. And he looked at me and he's like, walked around me, he said, okay, we have to start all over again. So that was, basically what, that was the beginning of my training. So we started, of course, with building it from the ground up. So starting with santisha, so like correcting the posture or what? Everything. So initially he'll start with the general structure. So first you'll make sure the general structure is correct. That includes placement, angles, predominantly placement and angles. But then he, and this probably won't be in the first day, but then he'll move on to the underlying or contained energetic manifestations. So where is the force and what kind of force you're using? You can't see it. It has to be told to you. And then, of course, this is led by intent. So those two things usually start coming out at the same time, because the easiest way to explain somebody how to manifest the correct force muscularly or with his body is by explaining the intention that should be there. And then usually this is why the saying of the 3 internal harmonies about Yi being first, right? And at the end you've got Li is so valid, and it's something that people, kind of misunderstand, but it's not a separate thing. It's one thing, the intention. When the intention is there and then it manifests in your body, then the muscles start, or the tension of the muscles, the ligaments and how they work starts to manifest. That you could consider the manifestation of qi for all intents and purposes, which is then physical, which produces physical power, right? So this is the most important thing, and it was also the hardest thing. Even with santisha, the second we added the correct intention and the correct contained powers, etc., suddenly standing even for 10 seconds was torture. It's not the same anymore. So this is usually what we began with. And I remember in the beginning that I couldn't stand for very long. And I'd start, suffering quite quickly. And he'd see that and he'd say, don't worry, change legs. I said, but it's only been like a minute. He's like, doesn't matter. Change onto the other side and do that until you start to collapse on that side and then change to the other side. He said, because there's no point in you staying on one side and doing it badly now because you can't hold it, but just staying there for a long time. And this, again, is what, again, a big misunderstanding of standing or doing Jianzhuang, post-standing, and doing specifically Santi Shi. People sit and ask you how long you stand for. That shouldn't be the question. The question should be, how do you stand? Because I can stand in a very nonchalant way for an hour if you want me to, but it's not going to have the right effect. It's pointless. So it's better to stand correctly for shorter than to stand incorrectly for longer.
Would you then, would Dilaushu then move on to the 5 fists or to moving exercises quickly, or would you actually practice, so like focus on Santi Shi for a relatively long time? I guess not 3 years, like some people have this idea with Mabu for 3 years or Santi for 3 years or stuff like that. But how quickly would you guys move on to moving exercises?
So that's an interesting question, because I had this discussion with him and he told me about, classically you stand for 3 years, and his teacher stood for 3 years. And he said, but he feels it's not required. So he himself wasn't forced by his teacher. He stood for 3 months, my teacher. Okay. Because here's the thing, as we come into more, we got to also understand the differences in mentality and the standards of society are not the same. A lot of that 3 years thing had to do with that aspect. It wasn't really, it's not to say you've got to take 3 years to develop skill, otherwise your Gongfu is incorrect. That's not it, because you never stop doing Santi Shi. We start every single training session with Santi Shi. It's something you'll do for the rest of your life. So if you're standing for 3 years, it's not particularly about Santi Shi. It's about a whole lot of other things, including a testing of character, X, Y, Z, cultural connections with regards to other aspects that are not so well known, but they're classically within Confucian learning aspects as well. So he didn't make me stand, of course, for 3 years, but we didn't then go very quickly into other things. He's adamant, you start with Santi Shi, then you start with footwork. Basic footwork. So we started with basic stepping before we did any of the upper body actions. And that has to start developing. And then slowly you'll start moving into the elements, usually on the spot first. And then you start combining it with the footwork. And then once the footwork and the handwork is correct, you move on to the second elements. When you start getting to the third, it starts to change, because in Hebei, Xingyiquan, our Bengquan, the first version or the primary version is considered Banbu Bengquan, half-step Bengquan, which is now a different type of stepping compared to the previous stepping that you did with the first basic versions of Piquan and Zhuanquan. So then again, you start learning a completely and focusing on a different version or a different method of stepping, which has a very different energetic property to the normal stepping. It's not just half a step like some people think. It's got... In some senses, it has a complete inversion of the energies contained in a normal step. But that's too technical a thing to discuss just over a conversation. And then, of course, the fourth and the fifth, you start have zigzag stepping with their own peculiarities. So he would very clearly start with stepping. And then basically, as you start doing each element, you first do it on the spot. And then you move into doing them combining with the stepping.
But what I get from that is that, because outwardly, I mean, even the 5 elements look quite simplistic, but you guys focus a lot then on the quality of movement in each part of these very kind of, again, outwardly looking simple exercises, right?
Yes, so they look simple. And that's also been something that I've found to be somewhat of a universal truth with Chinese martial arts. The techniques that outwardly look elaborate and complicated or complex are usually a lot less simple in terms of their structural and vector requirements in the body. And the techniques that are generally simplistic looking from the outside to the untrained eye are usually very refined and complicated with their body mechanics and their vectors. So it's a constant refinement. I mean, like I said, we do Santi Shi forever. You'll also do the 5 elements forever. And there's not just one version of each of the elements. There's variations that start to be added on top. So it's a constant thing. It's a constant thing. Another thing that I didn't mention that my teacher heavily focused on is Gongfu and Neigong. And he might start teaching basic versions as you start your training, like one type of very simple Gongfu, but as you train with him longer and longer, he introduces deeper and more refined versions of Neigong and Gongfu. And these work on 2 levels. They work on a physical level and a subconscious or psychological level. So they have very specific movements and motions with very specific intentions, but you have to coordinate it with specific breathing. And this starts over long periods of time, working on you on a subconscious level, which programs you to move in a specific way when your hands or your legs are doing a specific action that is contained in there. And then when that action or that type of movement appears in the 5 elements or the 12 animals, you've already started refining that part of the body mechanics through the Neigong and the Gongfu. It starts to come out. You start to go, okay, this makes sense now. So it's a very refined and very systematic method. It's not haphazardly thrown together. It's very systematic.
So these Gongfu, would you practice these sitting down, standing, moving, just to get an idea?
So sitting down, not really. That would be something else. That's like Shoshin, like when you're doing recovery stuff, we have stuff like that. That's not really working on mechanics and stuff. But the large majority of them are usually moving. Your feet are usually staying either on the spot or they're moving very slightly one step left and right, depending. There's quite a few of them. But they're for the most part moving. So we do static, of course. Santi Shi is a static Gongfu. You can consider it some type of Neigong. But we favor doing moving Gongfu more. So you will do the static, but for us, it's better to do more moving Gongfu on Neigong and Gongfu on the spot than to do static.
Interesting. I see a lot of parallels to Chinese Taiji in that regard. Quite interesting. And assuming that you reach a decent level with that practice that you described, I mean, with Santi and the 5 fists and also introducing these elements of Gongfu, where would you go from there? You already mentioned the 12 animals, but I'm sure there are also other exercises that you would then start doing, or like what would be the next level, the next step?
So usually once you've done the 5 elements, you start to do some sort of a 5 elements linking form. So that would be your first introduction to starting to not do single individual techniques in repetition one after the other, but to change techniques. So that's in essence what the basis of the first linking form would be, showing you how to connect different techniques as opposed to just one or the other. And that would be generally the first progression. You would do Xingyiquan. One of the benefits of Xingyiquan, which is quite logical in its approach, is we do hundreds of repetitions of each exercise on a daily basis. If you're doing one line of Pichuan, depending on your space, and let's say you go out and you do 10, and you come back and you do 10, and you do 2 lines at every training session, you're doing 20, 40 repetitions of that one technique every day. You hit the number 10,000 in a relatively short period of time. That's why it's actually a double-edged sword. If you're doing it correctly, you're going to hit a level of competence quickly, as long as you do each repetition correctly. But the other double-edged part of the sword is that if you're doing it wrong, you will ingrain it badly very quickly. So that's one of the aspects that is quite important in Xingyiquan. The fact that we do so many repetitions, you have to make sure it's correct. And that's one of the aspects that my teacher focuses on. But once you've done the 5 elements linking, you'll probably start doing the animals. At some point, you'll do the animals. My teacher's quite keen on getting you to start doing quite at that point, you'd probably have already started doing basic spear exercises. The spear body mechanics are actually the core of the 5 elements. So it's really important. For me, it was almost a key that unlocked a lot of the vectors and body mechanics in the 5 elements was when he started showing me exercises with a spear. Some of them are standard techniques that you're used to, like lanaja. Some of them are not. They're completely unique exercises, including shaking, including rolling, including other things that we used to do with it. It's quite a lot, but they help you to develop the correct mechanics that then come out again in the bare hand. So the 12 animals for us is more a taking of the vectors and mechanics that you've developed in the 5 elements up to that point. And each animal usually either has one or more vectors that it's combined from the 5 elements. And then it either goes deeper into one or the other, but it's based on the 5 elements, but in reality it's the application of the 5 elements. So if you look at the first animal, which is Longxing or dragon, it really is Qizhuan Luofan. It's literally rising and drilling, overturning and falling on a very big scale with a peculiar type of body mechanic and additional techniques that are applicable to use. But if you look at its meat and bones, it's Piquan. It's just a version of Piquan. So if your vectors of Piquan are developed correctly, then Longxing will come out correctly. If you look at the first version of tiger that we do, which is like Hupu, it really is, if you want to look at it from a broad perspective, it's double-handed Piquan. It's 2 hands doing Qizhuan and Luofan. So you see how it's very much connected. As you do other variations, etc., you'll see more aspects to, like this one's got some Pi and some Hung in it. This one's got Piquan hands, but Pao Chuan's footwork with a little bit of Beng Chuan's energy in it, right? So when you start seeing it like this, you start realizing how the 5 elements actually drive the 12 animals.
So you basically want to kind of take the same principles and body mechanics and look at them from different perspectives and experiment with them in different contexts, I guess, also for different techniques to ingrain them more.
Well, it's teaching you how to apply them in a multitude of ways. So that's why it's elements. I mean, it's elements that make up something, right? Yeah. So that's how I think is a healthy way to see it.
How does partner training feature into this? Because this is usually a kind of a point of contention in a lot of, maybe not just Chinese martial arts, but also especially in internal martial arts. Like, when do you start with basic partner exercises, or how does the progression go in Xingyiquan usually?
Pretty early as well. So usually at that point, when you've done the 5 elements, you start learning something called Jiao Shou Pao. Or Sanshou Pao. Sanshou Pao just means 3 hands clash, right? So it's got, depending on the lineage, it's usually 3 elements or so that you do with a partner in succession. He's doing, his 3 are spaced at a way that they counter your 3, which are countering his 3, right? So you do 2 versions. One is usually on the spot, the other one is moving. So you start to progress into certain partner exercises. And then there's drills as well that you can do that are like pulling out of that, like Pao and Beng combined with the partner doing versions of P, and things like this, stepping, not stepping, etc. So ideally, it starts at that point already. You start understanding how these things work and where they should work. And like when you withdraw your hand, your rear hand in Piquan, while most people focus on the lead hand that's extending, well, the rear hand elbow is scraping your ribs. So if I start punching at your ribs, you start realizing why that rear hand has to be drawn in and why it's scraping and hitting back so hard while the front hand attacks a neck or whatever. So all of these things only start to really make sense when you do this type of partner stuff.
Do you then go from there to more like freestylish types of practice? Is there, like sparring or wrestling type of stuff, or like Taiji's Tui Shou or something like that, like pushing hands?
So pushing hands and wrestling are not really the tactics of Xingyiquan. Xingyiquan is a slightly different tactical approach to combat. you do start going into free fighting, and we had different ways of doing that as well, controlled, or you can put on gear. The best method is to put on some gear. Because it's safe. You're also both learning about your inabilities, mostly. Hope people realize that the point of that sparring is to realize how much you suck. Not at defending yourself, because you might be able to hang back and block things, but you'll realize how much you suck at actually applying something too. So it's an important process. But yeah, we do go on to that kind of stuff too. But this really depends on who's at training. And that's another aspect of the reality of Chinese martial arts as it's always been. You know, I'll be there if I'm there and there's one of the other more, one of my Kung Fu brothers who's a little bit more accomplished. Yeah, maybe he'll do that. But there's a lot of people that just don't feel like doing that. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm not going to force somebody to do it if they don't want to do it. So it all depends on who you're with. I had a few of my Kung Fu brothers that we do this quite regularly with. I still do it with them. So, you know, we do that. And Master D is very supportive of it, you know. I'd see him enjoying it quite a bit, standing on the side and giving his feedback on why your punch sucked or why this guy's punched you in the face so many times, you know. So, yeah.
You probably also don't want to do this with complete beginners because they don't have any skills to really work on while sparring, right? I mean, when there's nothing there,
no, there's no point. That's why I say we go from set movements to set forms to set partner work. You can only go from set to free slowly. You can't immediately go to free. He's just going to flail his arms around like a lunatic.
No. Do you have, this is usually another controversial point, do you have specific like strength training? Is it encouraged, or even weight training, or like conditioning? Like, Southern Chinese styles obviously have a lot of like hardening the body and like iron shirt methods. Is there something either in terms of toughening up, hardening up, or also strength building in Xingyi and Hebei Xingyi?
Yeah, so conditioning partner stuff you do as well, and with trees, very common. I remember even doing... you got the usual things that you've seen in a lot of Chinese martial arts: arm bashing, body bashing, thigh bashing, whether you do it with a partner. But I also remember my teacher in the beginning telling me to do hu on a tree, tiger pouncing on a tree, over and over again. Our oblique kick, kicking a tree over and over again. That's part conditioning and part learning how to issue force, right? So there's that. Of course, the strength side of things, I often remember beginners, and if they were a little bit younger, my teacher telling them to do push-ups and stuff there, you know. So there's no aversion to this. Even stretching, which I think is one of the things that a lot of traditional Chinese martial artists seem to neglect. Stretching. So we don't kick high in Xingyiquan, but we would stretch. My teacher as well. He had great flexibility. He's very old now, but in his younger years, he could fold himself in half. So, you know, and I kept my stretching. So he would always encourage me to stretch, even throwing your legs up and down to stretch. It's not about kicking per se. It's about having flexibility. So strength training, of course, as well. I mentioned basic things, but remember the spears we use in Xingyi are big. So when we use a daganzi, that's quite a lot of weight. And it's if you're doing a lot of repetitions, you're doing strength training. So this is why I also find it quite strange when you hear a lot of internal martial artists saying, no, don't do any weights. All right, so put the big spear down. Because it's a weight. Whether you like it or not, it's just an applied weight. You're using it in a very specific way, but don't fool yourself. Your muscles are getting stronger by you doing that. So we favor those kind of things. So we have Gongfu with bricks as well, you add more and more bricks, and they have specific movements. But literally, it's building muscle and strength. So yes, we have these aspects as well.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, we just want to mention we also have the daga, and it's very common in a lot of northern styles, right? To use like long poles and spears for training.
Right. And if you look at like even Bagua, it was very common for people to do iron hand. So I find it strange when people say, oh, we don't do conditioning today. Oh, you just go back 1 or 2 generations, you see a lot of these people were doing conditioning. Whether they were bashing their arm on a wall, on a tree or a wall, the forearm doing zuanquan, you're doing conditioning. Don't fool yourself. That's what that is, right?
Now, I guess with some of the conditioning, there's also, I guess you have to be careful, at least with some of the exercises regarding health. At least, I think when you overdo it, that seems to be a strong argument, then it might actually also be damaging to health. But how does health in general feature into Xingyiquan? I would assume that you don't do crazy conditioning anyway, but in the sense of like ruining your hands or your fingers just to get this iron palm thing or something. But
yeah. Most people aren't employed in caravan escort agencies anymore. So the requirement that your hand better be hard as steel so you can save your life is not really existing anymore. So I would say it's not if you want to do it, go ahead by all means, but it's not really something that I think you need to that degree anymore. I think I practice conditioning a little bit more than some of my other Gongfu brothers, because you do need to have conditioning for something to be used effectively. You're going to have at least some level of conditioning, right? So health-wise, everything in moderation. Of course, a lot of the Neigong we do is about health preservation. It's got more than one use. It's not just about the body mechanics. It's also about health building as well. So from that point of view, the health building is included in the training. It's an all-in-one package. So you spoke about damaging your fingers. In the past, for example, Liangstyle Bagua primarily focuses on chuanzhang. Chuanzhang is piercing palm, and we do it very much because it came through yin style. We do it like yin style. It's a piercing palm with your fingertips. Back in the days, the guys were conditioning their fingers. I heard stories of people doing so much conditioning that they didn't have fingernails anymore. So this is the reality of the use of those techniques. We don't need to get to that level anymore, of course, but some degree of conditioning is advisable.
No, and like you said, that would have been my next question, this idea of that you don't need extra exercise for health, because I sometimes see that, but actually it's built into the practice that the practice should be supporting, boosting, or at least maintaining health.
Yeah, so you'll never hear my teacher saying he's teaching you Qigong. Because first of all, that's generally a newer term, but those types of practices within our Xingyi and our Bagua were always called Neigong. And they weren't ever that, okay, now I'm doing this and it's only for health, and now I'm doing this and it's only for martial. It was usually combined. So they had both aspects. I remember a lot of the time with the Neigong practices, which had specific vectors of development. My teacher would always tell me, all right, when you're doing this, you're inhaling until you're completely full, very slowly. And then while you're timing it to exhale until you're completely empty, So we were working on aspects that you would think are somewhat useless if you're just looking at the functional use of a technique, but they had other uses in terms of the health effect.
Yeah. Does this go for kind of more like introspective training as well? Let's use terms like, mindfulness or meditation, for lack of a better word. These are also charged terms. But is this also something that's included in the training? Do you have specific exercise for this, or is it?
Well, if you know how intent heavy Xingyi is, and then when you're doing Zhanzhuang, it's not different from doing mindfulness meditation. It really isn't. It reaps the same rewards. It's just a different road to the top of that hill. So
yeah, that's what I assumed, because I know a lot of people usually think that, okay, so I have my practice, now I just need to find these couple of Neigong practices, and then that will make my practice better. But it's not really integrated into what you normally do, and that's kind of, I don't know, seems weird to me.
I don't remember how long ago it was, but I remember one day my teacher telling me, okay, don't do Pichuan like that today, do it like this. And he was doing it with me, and each repetition of Pichuan took like 45 seconds. And we did it like that, going across the floor really slowly. It took like half an hour to do a line or two of Pichuan. So when somebody's saying he needs to go find something from outside, usually it's staring at him right in the face. He just doesn't know where to look or how to access it.
Yeah. Now, you're also teaching yourself, right? I mean, I know that you also do some stuff online, but do you also teach in person in Beijing?
Yeah, well, I mean, my teacher's daughter lives in Australia. And just before the pandemic, he had been down there. And, as he's getting older and she wants mom and dad to be closer. And that makes sense, one child, elderly parents. So then the pandemic, and he's kind of been there. He hasn't been able to come back since. But the reality is, I don't know if even now things are open, he'll probably not be spending as much time every year here when he does come back. So in that period, some of my Kung Fu brothers and I would carry on with my training. They would just come to me and we train together. So, and because I'm one of my teacher's, more closer students, I've learned pretty much the most out of all of his disciples. I would be helping them too. So I kind of grew out of that. So I don't know if I'd call that teaching on its own, but it is teaching, right? I'm also training at the same time. And yes, I started the online program, and I occasionally have people that do either online classes or some of them in person here. And that's just grown out of that, kind of organically.
Mm-hmm. I'm also asking about the teaching because usually at the end of an episode, I'm really interested in seeing where you would like the maybe not the whole martial arts community. I think that's too big, but maybe the internal martial arts community, or specifically people who practice Xingyi and Bagua, where that community, where do you hope that community should go? Like, how should it develop? Like, what's important to you? What would you like to see in the Chinese martial arts world?
Well, I don't know, from the general Chinese martial arts world. I mean, one of the things that I was quite happy with after I stopped working for the International Federation was that I was able to just focus on my arts, right? So my art being Xingyi and Bagua. So, and I know what I'm trying to do with that for posterity's sake. So I don't want to talk in general about Chinese martial arts, but specifically with Xingyi and Bagua, what I have seen over the last few years is, back in the day, you had what you would see mostly Southern styles that were starting to be taught in the West initially, everything from Choi Lei Fu to Hung Gar to Wing Chun, which are all great styles, right? And then you started to see Tai Chi coming out, and that was interesting because it was so different. And what I've kind of seen over the last few years is that it seems like they're using the next couple of arts of Xingyi and Bagua as a new soup of the day kind of thing. Oh, you're tired of that old dish there. We've all seen Wing Chun. We've all seen this. So let's start selling and advertising Xingyi and Bagua now. So suddenly you see this explosion of access, even down to people teaching it. But the quality is very... well, let's just say it's not where it should be, right? So if I could say anything, I would like to see a lot more honest, competent people coming out, and a lot less people just saying, oh, these 5 elements, I can just quickly learn those and teach them. And, people are interested now because it's like the hot topic. So let's teach that, because it's just degrading things, right? So in that sense, that's and I don't want to talk for anybody else. That's why I hold myself to a high standard. So at the end of the day, if I'm going to preach, I should walk the walk first.
Yeah.
So my goal is just to do everything I do as best as I can. If you haven't done your best, you can pretend that you did your best, but deep inside if you haven't. So that's as far as I can take it, is to do my best.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a fair and interesting perspective, because a lot of the discussions online usually revolve around, can people who train traditional martial arts, specifically Chinese martial arts, can people who train that actually fight and know everything? And then people sometimes suggest, you just have to do more sparring. But my impression is that actually, like we said before, when you don't have any skills to apply, then sparring also doesn't help you. So I think maybe the competent teaching and training should actually come first. And
I would say the other side of that whole question is, I think people need to be a little bit more down to earth when they ask that question about fighting. Can you fight? And the question is, fight who? Who are you fighting? I mean, if you're talking about can you protect yourself when there's an altercation outside that randomly happens because some guy bumped into you and then became aggressive, yeah, probably. But if you think you're going to enter and fight with professional athletes, that's something else you have to prepare for, right? So I think people need to be a little bit more realistic about what these arts were for, where they were aimed at being trained and used, and just accept it. You can't take a square peg and shove it into a round hole. I'm not going to use Xingyiquan and go become the UFC champion using pure Xingyiquan. It's not possible. The format doesn't accommodate it. You'd have to cut so much out. You'd then also have to train a whole lot of other things because the situation is different. And then you'd have to become an elite level athlete physically because that's who you're fighting against. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? So I would hope that people would become a little bit more sane with their whole discussion on this topic.
Yeah, a slightly more nuanced approach, I think, would be very helpful. Yeah. All right. Yeah, I think that's a very good note to end on, because that is pretty much also what I'm hoping for. So thanks for that. And thank you for the insights into Xingyi. That was quite interesting. And at least, I mean, for me, I already knew a little bit about Xingyiquan, but I never really trained it except for like a little bit at a workshop once. But I got a much better idea of how the training is supposed to work. So, and I hope that other listeners will also get that impression.
Well, I'm glad. I enjoyed talking to you. And so for me, talking about Xingyi is always something that I enjoy doing. So thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah, you're welcome. And let's see, there might be other topics that we, can talk about later. Like I said this before we started taping, maybe discussions about specific aspects of Chinese martial arts could be very interesting to have your perspective on there as well. And,
okay.
Yeah.
All right, great.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And, talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. Have a good day.
Thanks for listening to this episode. I hope you had a great time. The next episode will air next month. And until then, feel free to check out our Instagram account, where we also feature some of the people we talk to, other practitioners and teachers of Chinese martial arts, and anything else that might be interesting in the world of Gongfu. Thanks, take care, and hope to meet again.